You're going to be very surprised to find out this is not the kind of rebellion most Christians think. A lot of believers get terrified by this passage because they fundamentally misunderstand the kind of rebellion here. So Hebrews chapter 3, verse 15 is where we are in this Bible study walkthrough. I'm going to teach you how to read the Bible as best as I can. It says, "As it is said, today if you hear his voice, don't harden your hearts as in the rebellion." Now, we talked about this in the last Bible study walkthrough, the kind of rebellion in mind and the kind of hardening of the heart, and how we've seen this already up to this point in Hebrews as a repeating idea that's being, communicated to the audience as something they should not do, right? They should not harden their hearts. They should not be rebellious like a certain kind of people. Okay, so verse 16 is where we find ourselves officially. And when we read the Bible, we always want to read things in context. So I'm circling verse 16 to let you know where we are. But what we're reading now is going to relate to what came before it. So it's on us to think about these things as we study and read the Bible. For instance, as we navigate this one verse, I'm going to highlight a few ideas that I want you to think about and meditate on, and also maybe backtrack throughout the rest of Hebrews and see if you see these ideas elsewhere, right? It says, "For who were those who heard and yet rebelled?" I'm going to highlight the word rebelled, past tense, and the word heard, because I'm going to let you know ahead of time, as we've been going through this letter to the Hebrews, we've already seen the concept of hearing a message that is from God, and we've seen also the other idea of rebelling against that message several times up to this point. And the kind of rebellion in mind against this message that was heard, being the Torah, the Mosaic Law in the Old Testament, right? The kind of rebellion in mind is a hardening of the heart, even though the voice of God was heard, through the giving of the Torah to the Israelites. So that becomes the case study or the example of everything that the author is going to say to do and not to do, right? And the word "for" is important. It's letting us know, hey, because here's my reasoning, or let me expand on the idea of rebellion. Who were those who heard and yet rebelled? Was it not all those who left Egypt led by Moses? So when we read the Bible, for instance, and there's a comparison being drawn or an example being given, like in this passage, the example is something that happened in the wilderness with a certain kind of people. So what I want to do is highlight in yellow any characteristic or description of the kind of person that is an example for us, right? They left Egypt, they were led by Moses, they heard, and yet they rebelled. These are four, characteristics of the kind of person that the author is warning us not to be like. And the reason we want to think about this and meditate on that is because whatever kind of person is the example, that's going to relate to the kind of rebellion that is in mind, right? So the kind of rebellion being committed is by a certain kind of person. It's very important that we understand that. When you read the Bible, it's on us to really make sense of who's being talked about, what's being, given up front, what's the example, the illustration, what are some similarities, right? So verse 17, and, in other words, this word "and" is going to continue the thought of verse 16 or add to it in some way or clarify. Let's see which ends up happening in verse 17. That's why I end up circling words like "and" or "for," conjunctions. "And with whom was he provoked for 40 years?" We have here another description of this kind of person. They provoked God for how long? For 40 years. Can you think of anyone that fits this description? They heard the message from God, chose to rebel. Even after leaving Egypt, led by Moses, they provoked God for 40 years. And just so we're clear, he'll explain who it is. Was it not with those who sinned, whose bodies fell in the wilderness? Now, I think if you have been a Christian for a while or you've grown up in church, you know exactly who these people are. It's the rebellious, wicked generation of Israelites that rejected God and rebelled against Moses over and over and over after being, liberated from Egypt, right? They didn't make it into the promised land. So, maybe what I should do as a Bible student is when an event is referenced, or when an old character is referenced, or story. I want to go back and read that, because the better I understand what actually happened in that original context, the better I'll understand how the author is employing that in his main points here in Hebrews. Okay, so that's another tip I have for you, is to do that. Whenever you see an Old Testament passage or story referenced or piece of wisdom, go back to that original passage, read it in context, and then come back and you'll have a lot more understanding of what the author's trying to emphasize, right? Because if I have no idea about this story, I've never heard it before, there's going to be a lot of gaps that I won't have filled, a lot of misunderstandings and misconceptions I'll bring to the table as I interpret this, right? So here we have, and the reason I've highlighted in yellow each time a description is because what I notice as I read this is I see a list developing. And when you notice a list developing in Scripture, whether it's a list of events or people or characteristics, it's on you to just highlight that, right? Just circle it, just take note of it and go, interesting. What I see over and over is a continual description of this kind of person or group of people. So I want to take note of that and recognize that's important, that's significant for this passage, and that will help me interpret this properly, right? And, to whom did he swear that they would not enter his rest? Once again, another description of the kind of person. Now, what I want you to understand is these people didn't enter into the rest of God, right? But, right, those who were disobedient. So in other words, God swore they would not enter his rest. Who's they? To those who were disobedient. Whom did God swear this to? Well, to those who were disobedient. So it's almost like the author is answering his question within the question. Who did God swear that they wouldn't enter into his rest? Wasn't it to those who were disobedient? It's like, well, why'd you ask in the first place? Well, so he could answer it for you, right? So here we have two more descriptions. They were disobedient. They did not enter his rest. Now I want you to think about this. We want to read the scriptures in a way where we're pacing ourselves and going slow enough to recognize any repeating ideas or words that we've already seen. Have I seen the word disobedient? Have I seen synonyms of this word or idea? Have I seen the concept of rest already? And the answer is absolutely. Go back to chapter 3, verse 11. You'll see it. The answer is absolutely. For disobedience, I've seen that over and over. Rebellion, up here. Disobedience, not listening, unbelieving, being evil. All these different ideas. I've seen that. And so I just want to pay attention to any repeating ideas because it will give me clarity on the meaning of this text, right? So as I said earlier, there's a list developing, and I noticed that. So I just want to pay attention to that because that tells me one of the emphasis of this passage, emphases, however you'd pluralize that, is that there is a focus on a kind of person committing a kind of rebellion, right? So we see that they were unable to enter because of unbelief. The last description, two descriptions of this person. So this word "so" is important when you read the Bible. It's almost like in conclusion, or here's what we can conclude, right? Or here's what we can reason from this. We see they were unable to enter because of unbelief. Enter what? When you read the Bible, ask questions. So I'm going to put question marks. Enter what? Now you probably have already seen the answer to this if you were reading slow enough to recognize it. He already told us what they were unable to enter. They were unable to enter his rest. So what I want to do is just take note of the fact that the word enter is used twice. Okay? Sometimes, I'm not saying always, but sometimes when you read the Bible and you start to see a word or an idea almost like developing and repeating way more and showing up a lot more. Like in one verse, all of a sudden you see the word rest out of nowhere showing up a few times. Sometimes that's an indication that the author is transitioning or adding in a new idea or theme. He's putting his attention on a new idea, and he wants you to notice that. He's slowly introducing a new idea that connects to what he's already talked about. So in this case, I know the word enter is something I should pay attention to, because chapter 4 is going to be all about entering, if you can see this, entering his rest. So I'm giving you guys a little bit of foresight to know that this is the author slowly introducing us, a little more easing us into the idea of entering into the rest of God. Okay, so far, the kind of rebellion, to answer the question I put forth up front in the beginning, which was, hey, is this the kind of rebellion most Christians think? Is this a believer, someone who trusts in God, is a born-again Christian, believes in the Messiah, looks to God for salvation and righteousness? Is that the kind of person committing rebellion in this passage? The answer is absolutely not. They are people who have heard a message from God or heard his voice, the Torah or Moses, or even at the base of Mount Sinai, we have the generation of Israelites hearing the voice of God interpreted as like lightning and thunder, right? They chose to rebel anyway. They left Egypt led by Moses. They provoked God for 40 years. They sinned, which doesn't seem to be like they done messed up once. No, seems to be a continual, kind of way of life. Now you could go to the Greek and look at the verb tense. In fact, I encourage that. But if you don't have that ability, or you're not really familiar with how that works, you could just look at the surrounding context to bring more clarity to what this idea means. They fell in the wilderness, right? They didn't enter his rest. They were disobedient. So this disobedience doesn't seem to just note a one-time instance or occurrence, but it seems to note whatever tense sinning is. It seems to make sense to me that would be the same tense disobedience would be in, meaning if both are continual and lifelong and a lifestyle, right, then that really helps us make sense of the kind of person in mind. They were unable to enter because of unbelief, meaning they did not believe God. So this paints a picture for us of the kind of person committing a kind of rebellion. And if you read, I'll tell you what, I'll give you a little added nugget. Go read Ezekiel. I believe it's chapter 23. I could be mistaken. But it talks about how from the very beginning in Egypt, the people of Israel were attached to idols, worshiping idols, and God called them out of that, but they still didn't leave their idols even when they left Egypt. They brought that idolatry with them. That's very important to understand. This doesn't seem to be a person who ever trusted in the God of Israel or believed and looked to him for salvation and righteousness, or ever desired to follow his ways. This is a pattern, a way of life that is characterized by unbelief, disobedience, sinning, provoking God, rebelling continuously, even after hearing the message. Doesn't seem to be a believer, right? This seems to be someone whose heart is hardened and has rejected the ways of God. That's the kind of rebellion in mind. I hope that's helpful. If you guys did not already know this, if you struggle with reading the Bible, if you're confused and you're a new believer and you don't know where to start, I want to recommend our completely free 40-day Bible study program linked in the description below, as well as on our website at abovereproachministry.com. If that's overwhelming for you and 40 days is too much, check out our 27-day program or our 11-day program. All of them are self-paced, so you can go as slow or as fast as you want. There's homework, there's helpful tips, there's videos. 40 days should be more than enough to really help you find some grounding in how to read and study the Bible, even if you're a new believer. All right, so I hope you'll check that out, and it'll bless you. I'll see you guys in the next Bible study walkthrough. Thanks for watching.